Good afternoon, and welcome to the Economics of Soil Health Systems on 100 Farms webinar. We are so delighted that you all can attend this informative webinar hosted by the Soil Health Institute. My name is Dr. Latrina Staley, and I'm a soil scientist here at the Soil Health Institute. The Soil Health Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to enhance and protect the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. Today's webinar focuses on the economics when adopting soil health management systems and practices. This research aims to address the most frequent questions we receive from farmers, landowners, and their trusted advisors when deciding whether to adopt soil health systems and practices. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I ask that you please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and upvote those questions of interest. The moderator will select the questions to answer. With that, I am pleased to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Wayne Honeycutt. Dr. Honeycutt is president and CEO of the Soil Health Institute, where he leads the Institute's programs to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils. He previously served for 5 years as a deputy chief for science and technology with USDA NRCS in Washington, D.C., where he led programs to ensure NRCS conservation practices reflect the latest scientific advances for conserving the nation's soil, water, air, plant, animal, and energy resources. He served as a research soil scientist for 14 years and a research leader for 10 years with the USDA ARS. New England Plant Soil Water Laboratory, where he led and conducted interdisciplinary research on carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling and sustainable crop systems. In those roles, he led national research teams for predicting nutrient availability, developed procedures adopted by ARS for coordinating research nationally, published over 80 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and 10 book chapters, and received regional and national awards for technology transfer. He served on assignments on the USDA ARS National Program staff and to the United States Senate. Wayne's commitment to agriculture is rooted in his experiences with raising tobacco, corn, and other crops on his family's 120-acre farm in Kentucky. He holds a bachelor's degree in forestry and master's degree in soil science from the University of Kentucky and a PhD in soil genesis from Colorado State University. He is a graduate of the Mastering the Art of Public Leadership Executive Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., the Performance Excellence and Knowledge Executive Development Program of USDA, and the 2018 recipient of the Hugh Hammond Bennett Award, the highest honor bestowed on an individual by the Soil, Water, and Conservation Society. At this time, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Honeycutt.
Great. Thank you very much, Latrina. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure having you here. I'm going to share my screen and get us rolling here. So I assume everyone can see that. Latrina, we good? All right, assuming we are. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. Today, I'm really happy to present to you some research that we've been conducting for the last couple of years on economics of soil health on 100 farms, thanks to the generosity of Cargill that made this a project possible. I want to also acknowledge a number of the folks that have been working on this project. Dr. Archie Flanders, our ag economist, Christine Morgan, our chief scientific officer, and John Shanahan, as a former employee, was our agronomist that conducted also a lot of the interviews. So we know that a lot of these soil health practices and systems are really good for the environment. You can increase carbon sequestration, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Many of them can reduce the nutrient loss through both runoff and leaching. And a number of the practices also are, good for building up wildlife habitat, including pollinator habitat. But we also know that to really achieve these environmental benefits at scale means that we really need to look at the information and needs and experiences from our farmers, because they're the ones that's, quite frankly, going to be the ones that help us scale up these environmental benefits. So it's really going to come down to whether or not they decide to adopt these soil health practices and systems. And so this project was set up with the objective of providing that type of information, that economics information that farmers need when they're deciding whether or not to adopt these systems, because we recognize that farmers and ranchers, of course, too, are business persons. And so this is something really important that we try to analyze and understand. So the overall approach of this study was we interviewed 100 farmers across a 9-state region, and we wanted farmers that had been adopting these soil health management systems for a minimum of 5 years. And so I want to be clear here, this was not a random sample of all farmers across this 9-state region, but instead we were specifically looking for farmers that had been adopting these systems, again, for a minimum of 5 years. Most of them had been adopting it much longer than that. Our average length of adoption for no-till across these 100 farms was 19 years. In cover crops, for those who were using cover crops, they had been using them for an average of 9 years. But these 9 particular states represent some 71% of the corn produced and 67% of the soybean produced across the U.S. And you can see by the numbers on the right side of the map here, there's quite a range of climate covered across these sample areas and across the farms where the farmers that we interviewed. With a mean annual precipitation ranging from 20 to 55 inches per year and a mean annual temperature ranging from 43 to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, real wide range of growing conditions for things like cover crops and for things, that affect infiltration and all these other, aspects that are important for farmers. Also a wide range of growing degree days from 2,400 to 4,000. Some of you perhaps may not be really familiar with the growing degree day concept, if I can say it. It's basically just kind of that combined influence of temperature and time. For example, if you have corn growing for 20 days, but it's very cold, it's not going to be growing very fast. And so it is that combined influence of temperature and time that influences that plant growth rate for many of our plants. And so that's why it's important to look at this growing degree day concept also as an indicator of the range of climates that were represented here in this project. Here's a list of some of the characteristics of the crops that were on the farms. The first column on the left, of course, is the 9 states. You can see the number of farms where we interviewed farmers in each of those states, ranging from 10 to 16. They were predominantly corn and soybean. This is the average acres per state. So the numbers that are presented here. But then you have some smatterings of wheat, a little bit of cotton down in Tennessee, and a few other crops. But the primary, I think, emphasis of this table is to show you that these were not backyard gardens. These were commercial operations. In Illinois, the farms that we interviewed averaged 934 cropland acres. In Indiana, over 3,000 cropland acres. So very significant commercial operations. And in total, we interviewed farmers that covered some 194,000 acres. So quick math, of course, is that with 100 farms, that means we average 1,940 acres per farm for those farms that we interviewed. Looking at the soil health systems adoption, some of the soil health practices, what we have here on the y-axis is the percentage of planted acres, and the different colored bars here are just some of the different states, the average in each of the states where we interviewed these 100 farmers. You can see that they range from about 54% of their planted acres where they were using no-till, all the way up to 100%. I believe that was in Tennessee. And then average some 85% of their planted acres where they were using no-till across all these 100 farms. One of the things you would see is that the blue line here in Minnesota has some 54% of the planted acres using no-till. The farmers in Minnesota were telling us that the cooler, wetter soils there in that climate make it more challenging to adopt no-till practices. But what they were not doing in no-till, they were making up for and using reduced tillage practices. Looking over at cover crops, again, quite a wide range of use of cover crops, all the way from only using them on about 19% of their planted acres to over 80% across these 100 farms. One of the, I think, primary messages here is comparing these farmers with the U.S. average. The U.S. average is this far blue bar on the far right at each of these three groups of graphs. So compared to the U.S. average of some 37% of cropland acres in no-till, these farmers are way ahead of the curve, the farmers that we interview, with 85% of their cropland acres using no-till. And the same with cover crops. Some 53% of the cropland acres across these 100 farms are using cover crops, compared to only 5% for the country. So the bottom line is here is that we have a lot that we can learn from these farmers, from their experience with these practices. And so we felt very fortunate that they were able to give us their time and share their experiences with us. And I'm really happy to share that information with you all today. Now, in terms of the kind of the basic approach that we use for assessing the economics, was that we interviewed the farmers about all of their production information. We were not looking at receipts. We were not looking at all of their yield statistics and these things, but instead we were interviewing them about their production practices, what practices they use, what they were using before they started adopting the soil health management systems, and now what they're using after they adopted those practices. And so using this partial budget approach, again, we're not looking at every bit of the budget, every line item on a farmer's budget, but only instead comparing what things that differ. So for example, if they were using herbicide and then they started growing a cover crop, but they continued use of that herbicide, well, then that was not a line item in the budget that was compared. But if when they started, using that cover crop, and then that allowed them to now reduce the use or eliminate the use of an herbicide, for example, then now that became a difference. And that's something that then goes in the partial budget analysis for comparing. And because, market prices vary day to day, hour to hour, sometimes, particularly also significantly sometimes from year to year, season to season, we calculate the revenue using a standardized set of long-term average prices, and everything is kind of normalized for a 2019 dollars. Also, USDA payments, these are, of course, can be very, very helpful for helping farmers start on their journey. I strongly believe these are very strong financial incentives, payments to help farmers get over that transition and learn how to use these new practices. But because not every farmer participated in those programs, and because they don't last forever, we decided not to include those USDA payments in the analysis. And so what you're getting here is without any of those USDA payments. So this is the meat of the results in this table right here. There's quite a few items, but I'm going to step us through it. So on the categories, we have a number of different categories over on the far left of the table. And then in the middle, we have a couple of columns for corn, and then on the right, a couple of columns for soybean. So let's just take a look at the corn area. We've got benefits and we've got costs. And in the benefits, there's a number of different ways that you can derive benefits. You can do it by either reducing your expenses, or you can also do it by having additional revenue. And then, of course, then just totaling those to get your total benefits. In a similar way, there's kind of a couple of different ways you can incur costs. You can incur costs by having additional expenses, but you can also incur costs if you reduce your revenue, as that's marked down as an expense. And then, of course, then the total of those would be your total costs. So let's step through some of the kind of the primary categories where we saw some pretty significant changes between using a conventional system and the soil health management system. So one of the categories was seed, particularly for those that are using cover crops. You see that it was a pretty significant additional expense for seed costs. And this was highly related again to those that were using cover crops. Now, I want to point out something about this table and how the numbers here are constructed too. Some of you may realize that and may notice that these cover crop seed costs might be about half of what you would expect them to be. But remember, only 53% of the cropland acres they were using cover crops on out of these 100 farms. But what we have in our table here is an average across all 100 farms. And so that's why it may look like it's about half of what you would expect it to be. So all the numbers that we're presenting here are an average across 100 farms. Then the next kind of category that really kind of stuck out to us was reduced expenses in the fertilizer area. Now, it's really clear that when there are a lot of improved soil health, you can reduce your fertilizer, your nutrients, because you can enhance nutrient availability. When you enhance that organic matter in the soil, then you can provide more of the nitrogen to the crop, but also you can provide more moisture, and so that those plants can take up those nutrients. And so that really can lead to greater nutrient use efficiency. And cover crops also can, recycle some of those nutrients that might have been leached out of the root zone, can recycle them essentially back to the soil surface. And so farmers conducting, nutrient management practices, they will, bank on that. They will measure these things, and then they will adjust their fertilizer application rates accordingly. And so that brings up kind of another component of this, is that many of these farmers, they were really adamant about practicing the 4 R's of nutrient management. And so this is not something that's, just magically occurring or anything. And it's not just all biological. It's also because they were very, very good managers. And they were, sampling their soils, and many of them using variable rate, fertilizer applications and things like that. And so this is really why we say nutrient management is a critical component of a soil health management system. They really work arm in arm with one another. Another one of the big areas where there were some reduced expenses was in fuel, labor, and other services. A lot of this is attributed to use of no-tillage. When you go to no-till, then you can immediately observe a reduction in your fuel use because you're not having as many trips across the field. And therefore, you don't have to pay labor as much, for driving those tractors across the field. And you don't have as much wear and tear on your machinery. And some of your equipment ownership is also significantly reduced, using things like no-tillage practices. So these are like some really immediate benefits that can be provided when you shift to some of these no-till practices. Looking down in the kind of the yield component of the table, you'll see that a number of farmers did report a yield increase. In fact, 67% of them reported a yield increase. I think 2% for corn reported a decrease, and some 31% reported that it didn't change at all. Now, we recognize and acknowledge that technology can also contribute a lot, and it should contribute a lot to yield increases over time. But I wanted to share with you that when we interviewed farmers, we asked them about this. We specifically said, what are your changes in yield? Did you observe changes in yield? If so, which ones, how much of them do you expect were worth to, expected from technology, changes in technology, and how much did you attribute to the soil health management system? And there were a number of ways that they, factored in their answer to this. A few of them had different tracts of land where they were still using more conventional systems, and say they had that to compare, with their other plots and other fields, I should say. But then most of them were also comparing their yield data with neighbor farm data or information, and also with local, like county averages. And so they really understood that question and were very clear in their response about what was attributed to the soil health system and what was attributed to technology changes. So when we then just, of course, look at the total benefits and the total costs, then that allows us to calculate that change in net farm income. And so this is basically the kind of one of the heaviest and the most significant findings of the project was that they increased their net income by over $51, almost $52 per acre for their corn crop and almost $45 per acre for their soybean crop. Now, there are, of course, a number of realities. One is that every farm is different. And I think that everyone probably knows that. There's a lot of different aspects that go into what determines, their changes in their net income. But so I thought that you might appreciate seeing just what that distribution was, not just what the average was in terms of increasing their net income, but that distribution across 100 farms. And so this is what it is here. 85% of them reported an increase in net income. And you see it does have quite a range, but by far and large, again, 85% of them did increase net income on their farm, their corn crop. Some of those at kind of the higher end of the tail seem to be attributed to starting to market and receive a premium for some non-GMO crops. Some that were more kind of the lower end, they seem to be in general, some of those that were earlier on in that adoption phase. Kind of similar relationships, different numbers, but similar relationships for soybean, a wide, pretty wide range, but it's really clear that 88% of them reported an increase in net farm income, averaging $45 per acre. This is one of the reasons why we felt like it was so important that we did not do just a handful, of interviews and look just at a handful of farms. That we know every farm is different, and so we wanted a significant sample size to allow us to really come to a pretty confident conclusion on whether or not these soil health management systems are profitable and farmers are making them profitable and work for them. And we believe these results show that clearly the answer is yes. Also, I wanted to just show what some of the reductions in production costs are. So essentially this shows you that even if yield did not change, that they were still able to make more of a profit because of the reductions in production costs. So again, we have all the different states here with an average reduction in the production costs when growing corn by using the soil health management system of $24 per acre, and for soybean, reducing that production cost by $17 per acre. So again, even if yields stayed the same, just being able to reduce their production costs would allow them to become more profitable using these soil health management systems. Now, we also took the opportunity when interviewing farmers to ask them about additional observations that they had. And we already talked about how 67% of them reported that they were able to increase yield. And some 83% said they were able to reduce their fertilizer inputs. But again, I want to emphasize that this was a combination of being able to improve things like nutrient use efficiency and water availability that helps, your crop now take up those nutrients through the soil health management system, but also with the fact that these farmers were adamant about sampling their soils, and they were just really, really good nutrient managers also. So that nutrient management is a real key component of this soil health management system. And we're really excited to see how that's 97% of them said that adopting these soil health management systems increased their resilience to things like drought and heavy precipitation. We think that this makes a whole lot of sense because as they increase organic matter, then that increases available water holding capacity in the soil and therefore drought resilience. also helps the soil, hold more moisture. And that relates very much to the next item down there, increased access to their field. Some 93% reported that. And so if your soil can hold more water, then that means you're not going to have as much ponding on your soil. And so, when a farmer wants to get on their ground in the spring, they will be able to, or in between rains, they'll be able to sooner, to do what field operations they need to do. About 40% indicated that there was, at least locally, that they were making that connection, I think, with some of the banks and the insurance companies with which they worked, that some of their practices should provide a lower risk. And so they were finding that there were some improved loan and insurance terms. Interestingly, 100% of them reported that there was improved water quality. Now, I want to be clear, only a handful were actually having this measured. Some of them were participating in programs where the water quality was being measured coming off the edge of their fields. But most of them were basing this on the fact that they were now seeing a water that was running more clear than it used to. It's not as full of sediment, not as cloudy, not as muddy. Now it was running much more clear. And I've seen that too personally. And although there's not a quantitative value that, comes with that, that it's real. You know the difference in clear water versus muddy water. And so I feel very strongly about that observation too. And many of them were making that, relationship between, improvements of water quality to therefore protecting their license to operate. And some 54% of them were also, indicating that those that had measured their organic matter, that they also increased the organic matter in their soils. So just kind of a quick summary of our overall findings. The average farm size of the farms that were interviewed for this project was 1,940 acres. And on average, the soil health management systems reduced production costs by $24 per acre for corn and $17 per acre for soybean. The soil health management systems also increased net farm income for some 85% of the farmers that were growing corn and 88% of the farmers that were growing soybean. And then the soil health management systems also increased the average net farm income by $52 per acre for corn and $45 per acre for soybean. And I also just got through describing some of the additional benefits that a number of the farmers reported. We felt like it was pretty significant that some 93% reported increased access to their fields and 97% reported increased resilience to extreme weather. One of the reasons why I feel like this is so important is because we know the climatic data now, is the weather data like from NOAA and EPA and other sources, is showing us that there increased frequency of extreme weather events from all the way from drought to heavy precipitation. With climate change, as the air gets warmer, then that means, it can hold more moisture. So even though we can have these drought periods, but when it does rain, it can rain like crazy. And of course, that makes it a lot more erosive. And so if you have a soil now that's well armored with like residue on the surface or cover crops, then now you can reduce that erosion. Now you can really minimize the amount of nutrients that are running off of that into our lakes, rivers, and streams. So I feel like these are really important on-farm observations because they really kind of help position our agricultural systems for the future that we see, not just for the need for mitigating climate change, but also being adaptive to it. And so one of our main conclusions also is based on some of these current adoption rates in these states, which was 41% no-till and 6% cover crops. We feel it's really clear many more farmers could increase their net farm income from adopting these soil health management systems. Now, before we go into the Q&A, I just wanted to also share with you and make sure that you are well aware that one of the things we did was wanting to make this information as useful as possible to farmers. is we developed state-based webinars and state-based fact sheets so that farmers in a given state were just looking at the data, just most relevant to them. And so these items are on our SHI website, and I invite you to go to them and view any of the webinars or download any of the fact sheets that are, most pertinent to you. So with that, I want to just offer again really quick thank you to Archie Flanders, Christine Morgan, John Shanahan on our staff working with us on this project. Special thanks to Cargill for funding the project. It would not have happened without that funding. We are a nonprofit, so we're very dependent upon the generosity of others to conduct this work for the public good. And also special thanks to all the farmers that gave to us their time, shared to us their insights and their experiences. And so I will stop sharing there and turn it back over to you, Latrina.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Honeycutt, for that wonderful presentation. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and start our Q&A session for the webinar. Now, if you haven't already, put your question in the Q&A box, so you still have time to do that. So we're going to go ahead. We have quite a few questions here. So let's see. Okay, so the first one says, the farms included seem to have much higher adoption rates for no-till and cover crops than the population. One obstacle to adoption of these practices is the learning curve and knowledge required to transition to new practices. Can you speak to how findings from the study help us to address increasing use of these practices?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. Ben, I think that the reality is that a number of the farmers have been adopting these. We obviously found 100 of them here, but the key to that is understanding that business case because they are business women and men. And so they need to know if it will pencil out for them. So we think that this can really drive much more adoption just from projects like this. Now, there definitely are additional drivers. One is sure learning what practices work for you and your area, your climate, your production system. So there is that educational opportunity and need in many of these cases also. And one of the things actually I'll just share with you that we are working on at the Soil Health Institute is we've now developed a process for establishing the achievable levels for any soil, at least in the US, and we think beyond, can obtain. And so we think this can be an additional motivator for farmers because, so many farmers have been working their land for many, many decades and just may not realize now just how healthy it can become again. And they may be having a decent yield, a decent profit, and may not realize just how healthy it can get. And so our ability now to establish that achievable level, we call it soil health targets, it can really be that additional motivator too. So we think that, having additional training, this type of economics information, but then also knowing what can be achieved on particular soils can be, really helpful for getting that greater adoption.
Thank you. The next question is, ag climate schemes being offered are only offering $20 ton of carbon sequestered using such practices as cover crop adoption. NRCS offers much higher support for cover crop adoption, some over $100 per acre. What level of payment and for how long will one have to subsidize folks to transition to the adoption of cover crops so they can become as profitable as these 100 farms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm afraid I do not know the answer to that particular question, just how much someone would have to be paid in order to become profitable. I would say that we do see that as the very next step. Our first step with this project was to basically ask the question, do farmers who have been adopting these soil health management systems and practices for an extended period of time, at least 5 years, do they have beneficial, economic experiences? Is it profitable for them? And we think the answer is now clearly yes. And so now the next question that we want to answer is what does that transition period look like? How long does it take to become profitable? So I feel like that once we conduct that, and that's the next project we now are starting to look at, I think it will be help inform the answer to the question that you have.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is interesting that Tennessee had the highest age no-till but lowest percentage age for cover crop. Do you think this might be related? Might farmers adopting some practices be less likely to adopt others?
You know, I don't think that it's necessarily a relationship. Someone adopts one practice may not be as likely to adopt another. Like they adopt no-till, would they be less likely to adopt cover crops? I don't see that. You know, there are so many different aspects that influence adoption. We talked about, you know, education programs, financial motivators. You know, I talked about the soil health motivator, but you know, a lot of these decisions also come down to just kind of a lot local engagement. A lot of it also depends on just how much emphasis locally is being placed. If they're working, for example, with crop advisors that are seeing some of these benefits and that are working, you know, very frequently with farmers on those benefits and helping to understand them. And so there are so many nuances to adoption, including that whole social component that this project obviously did not touch upon. That it's hard for me to think that that there is that relationship. Now, I will say that a lot of these farms in that particular part of Tennessee were on relatively level land. And so perhaps it could be that they determined that, you know, that cover crops were not as needed there. I don't know. I'm just guessing here. And it just, which I probably shouldn't do, particularly on a webinar. But I would say that, you know, the bottom line is that there's a lot of factors that influence that adoption. And I think it's really hard to say if they adopt one practice, then they're less likely to adopt the other. Actually, my experience is that that's kind of the opposite is true. So many of them that adopt one, then they see the benefits now that they're really positioned to adopt the other also and follow up on it, because it really is that synergy of a lot of those practices working together where you can really amplify, you know, those benefits.
Okay. All right, our next question is, what share of cover crops did get terminated before maturity? Are there any cover crops that were also cash crops being used?
Yeah, I would probably have to ask Archie to see if he knows the answer to that. He and John were the ones collecting the data. I suspect there may be some of them that were using some of the cover crops for financial uses also, but I can't say. Archie, are you? Can you chime in here?
Other than some of the cover crops being grazed or harvested for forage, there would be no examples of any cash value for that. But there were some who were doing that with the cover crops.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, do you have data where you compare the earnings increase with how many practices are done? So is there a correlation between the type or number of practices and earnings increase?
That might be another Archie Flanders question. Archie, do you know if that data exists to allow that type of assessment?
We could separate farms out by those with and without cover crops, but some of the other more detailed information that would be necessary to determine different types of practices, the data would not be sufficient to calculate that.
Yeah. Good.
That was not our initial, that was not in one of our objectives when we undertook this.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Can we get data on vegetables and fruit? And can we get the questionnaire the interviewers used during the research?
Yeah, you know, we realized that this was primarily done in the Midwest, the corn and soybean country. We are now starting, we're just positioned now with some resources that are going to allow us to assess economics on a number of cotton farms. So we're really excited about that opportunity. But yeah, I mentioned that our next step is to really understand now this transition period economics, first 1 to 3, some maybe 5 years of adoption, and when it becomes profitable, if it's immediately or if it takes a little time, and what variables influence that rate of becoming profitable. But the second thing that we also want to do is expand this type of work beyond the kind of the corn and soybean in the Midwest to other parts of the country. California has some 400 crops, and so we may not be able to do all 400, but we would like to really expand and do this in a number of other different crops. We are working with partners at National Association of Conservation Districts with a project nicely funded by NRCS to conduct some of this research across the country for about 30 farms. And I believe we may have some of those producers that you just mentioned, the fruits, and I think there's even some nuts and things like that that's in that mix of data too. So basically, again, we're kind of limited with what resources we have to focus on, and so it's project by project. But I'm really hopeful we're going to continue striving to bring in enough resources to allow us to expand this type of work to these other operations and other crops.
Okay, all right. Okay, this is a wonderful, great questions. Okay, here's the next one. We are presently in a major drought in the Midwest and upper Midwest. Can a farmer justify planting cover crops this fall if the soil remains dry and the seed does not germinate in a timely manner to be able to survive the winter or not germinate at all?
Hey, Kurt, good to see your name up there. Thanks for joining in. I hope things are going well in Pennsylvania for you. I think, Kurt, unfortunately, I'm sure you probably realize that this requires a bit of a crystal ball. And I think that it's a really good question, though, because it's the challenge that farmers have when they are looking at investing in these practices and systems. And I think it kind of comes down to a focus on today, focus on tomorrow, focus on the future. And so, yeah, they might be experiencing a drought right now, but I guess, it's still just the end of September, and who's to say that there might not be a rain that now would allow that cover crop to germinate. And sure, it would be late, but, some of this becomes kind of law of averages as the weather varies from year to year and season to season. As I mentioned a while ago, there is increased frequency of these extreme precipitation events from drought to heavy rain. And so we are, and farmers are, increasingly challenged to know what normal is anymore. And so I strongly believe that adopting these practices, making this investment is what's going to position our agricultural economy, our farmers, our environment to adapt and mitigate, those climate effects.
Okay. All right. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. The benefits reported are based on farmers' observation, I assume, not documented by a scientific verdict, correct? For example, I would think that some of these areas are clearly intuitive, yet we can verify the SOM with testing, for example. That would give the result. Okay, sorry. That would give the results a bit more power, especially as policy folks are presently considering this area for funding. Would help maybe direct that funding to optimize benefit. That depends on how well the rules and regs are written based on such information of quality from farmers and ranchers. So the actual question was, the benefits reported are based on farmers' observation, I assume, not documented by scientific research.
Yeah. So again, as I kind of described, thanks, Jim. Thanks. It's good to see you tuning in too. And appreciate all the good work you're doing on the AGREE task force. This, as I mentioned earlier, the the process for this particular project was interviewing farmers, not asking them to go back into all of their records to show us receipts, but to instead tell us about what management practices they were using, and then put a dollar figure to those management practices and look at the differences. And so that was the approach that we used. There were, a lot of this is based on what their perception is and what they reported. But farmers know, they know whether or not things are increasing or decreasing. You know, they know what their input costs are from one year to the next. They know if they're going up or down. As you well know, if you farm, I know yourself too. And so, but things like soil organic matter, from yield test, or from not yield test, but from their test results, their soil test results. But many of these other components that they were describing they were describing their experiences that now we need to put pen and paper to.
Okay. All right. How does this look in moisture limiting environments? I continue to hear arguments against cover crops in arid Western systems because it will reduce yield and the crops grown for profit. Has HHI looked into this? Also, could you speak to any policy or economic systems changes that might be helpful to support increased adoption of soil health management systems?
Yeah, so this obviously was not in the real semi-arid regions, mostly subhuman and humid regions of the country. It is true that as you move further west, and there's so more moisture becomes more limiting, then you need to become even more finely tuned to your cover crop management and to what weather predictions there are, and basically kind of marry the two and achieve that balance. I know that there have been some studies conducted in Eastern Colorado, the very fine ARS unit out in Eastern Colorado, where they have looked at this and determined that, there is that point where cover crops can take up too much moisture that could negatively impact that following crop. There are other studies, however, that in an equally limited precipitation zone that have found that snow is very beneficial, and that you can increase that water intake, the infiltration, that you can increase organic matter and water holding capacity, and so you can build drought resilience. And so I think the bottom line is that when you move further and further west into an increasingly arid, semi-arid region, then it just makes it's imperative that become more and more fine-tuned with your management and understanding, what you need to do, when you need to do it. And that's why it's so important that we have local technical specialists working with local farmers and mentoring other farmers with adopting these practices and systems, and in the climate and those types of constraints that those local farmers will also be experiencing. That's at the Institute. That's why we set up local farmer-to-farmer networks and have mentors, farmers that serve as mentors to others, and local technical specialists, because they know when cover crops need to be planted by, terminated by, what works here, what doesn't work here, what the best seeding rate is, all these different, many other combinations. And so it's just not something that I think is done well from a distance or on high. It needs to be that local decision.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next question is, we are starting to see some data on cover crops releasing nutrients when they have a hard freeze. Can you help enlighten us about this? Is it something we should be concerned about? And if so, how do we address it?
Yeah, I've seen some of that information. I think the main thing to do is to be aware of it and to make it, kind of part of the testing procedure when you're looking at having your soil tests conducted. Look at the impacts that's having over time. there's just some things like that with the weather that we can't control. But I think that from what I've seen, the relative content from that type of source is not it's all that significant. Sure, it can be significant in some watersheds, but I guess I would suggest this is that if those plants, those cover crops had not taken up those nutrients and were in that plant material, guess where those nutrients might have been? They might have been leached down through the root zone, or they might have been now washed off and run off. And so those cover crops help now scavenge those nutrients deeper in the soil profile, brought them back up to the surface for that, next crop. And that they also now are preventing some of that nutrient runoff and erosion going into the surface water. And so this may be a little bit of risk that sometimes, you will have that freezing of plant material that can now, release some of those nutrients. But you're sure as heck going to get a lot more runoff and loss of those nutrients to your streams. You're sure as heck going to get a lot more loss of those nutrients through leaching to groundwater if you don't have those cover crops. And so I would put my money on the cover crops every day.
Okay. And have about 10 more minutes left. What was the range and how long the farmers had been in these soil health systems? Was the success rate related to the amount of time farms had been doing the practices?
I mentioned what the average was. On average, like about 19 years for no-till and 9 years for cover crops. Archie, would you like to, do you have the numbers in front of you on what the range was? And speaking with John, I understood from John that there were some indications that some of the earlier adopters basically were some of those that, not all of them, but some of those that had some lower net income changes.
Right. The range would have been the minimum in our study that we accepted was 5 years. And we had some that was about that time horizon. Then some of them have been doing it for up to 40 years. We had some farmers, the son was following up what the grandfather had done on the farm. But I tried to do some regression analysis to get a correlation between duration and profitability for the whole sample, and I couldn't determine any significance from duration doing it that way.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Flanders, for that. The next question is, how many years after initial implementation is generally the pivot to improve profit, given the negative profits for newer adopters?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that one?
Okay. How many years after initial implementation is generally the pivot to improve profit, given the negative profits for newer adopters?
Yeah. Oh, I see the question now. Thanks, Loretta. Yeah, I hate to guess without having the data. What you often hear is 3 years, sometimes 5. But I will also tell you that some farmers say that no, it's not really a kind of a biological limitation that takes a while to get more profit, to make it a profitable system, but it's a learning curve. And they describe it as a tuition that you pay when you're starting to learn how to use a new practice. I know this from my own experience. With starting to adopt new practices that first year, you learn a lot and know what you did that can be improved. In the second year, you learn a bit more. And by the third year, you're starting to get into a groove. And so I think it's kind of the combination of these things, that learning curve, but some of those also, perhaps some of the biological components too. But that's why I also say I think it's so important that we have local farmers that can, and technical specialists that can be mentors to other farmers in adopting these practices and systems. But we are hopeful that we have a project that's being queued up now that will allow us to put some numbers to that and really quantify those changes. But I did mention a while ago also that you can make some immediate reductions in your input costs, like from fuel and labor, it went as soon as you change to a no-till practices.
All right, we have time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
The next one is, where was enhanced government program payments such as CSP a factor in the reported cost benefits?
No, they were not. No, thanks, Jude. No, we did not factor in any of the USDA government payments, but it's because some of those payments, many of them are 3 years, sometimes 5 years or so. And so we did not want to, introduce that type of variability, and not everybody was using, subscribing to some of those government programs. And so we did not consider the Environmental Quality Incentives Program or their Conservation Stewardship Program or any other types of payments from USDA.
Okay. And the next one is, how close are we to an in-field quick test for soil organic matter and or biological indicators that seems to be a game changer, RE verification of performance?
Yeah, we are very, very close to quick tests for soil organic carbon. Our chief scientist, Dr. Christine Morgan, has been working and actually patented a technique for analyzing a carbon in the field and on the fly. And it's when you're also wanting that carbon as part of like a carbon market, then you also need a bulk density sample. So it's not just the concentration of carbon, but it's the density of that soil too. In order to calculate that carbon stock, you need both of those measurements. And the instrument that she and her partners, collaborators, developed determines both measurements at the same time. So we're very, very close to that. I would say that organic carbon, of course, is a key soil health measurement and indicator, but it's not the only one. There are some others, and we will be announcing what we identify as the most effective measurements and then just in the coming months, where we evaluated over 30 different soil health indicators or measurements at 124 long-term research sites across the US, Canada, and Mexico. And this is going to allow us to recommend the most effective measurements. One of them that is also shows a lot of promise is aggregate stability. There's others too, but the reason I bring up aggregate stability is because this is something that a farmer now can do by themselves. There is a phone app that you can use to basically video record the dispersion of aggregates and over time and over 5 or 10 minute period. And then there are algorithms that have been come up with, equations that can allow you now to relate that to changes in aggregate stability. And so we are looking at all of these types of things just for the exact reason that I think that, is the nature of your question, Jim, is that we want to be able to scale up adoption of soil health practices. And that means we need to be able to scale up our ability to measure how well we're doing and our improvements, monitor our improvements in the soil and interpret them. And that's where that soil health target concept that I was describing really comes into play, as it allows us to establish an achievable level of soil health. And so we're right now we're challenged to find the funding to allow us to really expand that, but it just has a whole lot of opportunity, and that we think farmers would we know farmers will love, because it's a big question they're asking us is, how do we measure it? How do we interpret those measurements?
Okay. Well, thank you all for your question. That actually concludes our Q&A session. Dr. Honeycutt, we just want to thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. And for any people who put a question in the chat box and it wasn't answered, we will definitely be following up with you.
Thanks, everybody.
You all have a safe and wonderful afternoon. Thank you.